Our next presenter is Shelley McLean, who will be speaking on maximizing educational experiences for students with ASD, implementing evidence-based practice within an inclusive education paradigm. Shelley is a New Brunswick educator and board-certified behavior analyst with 15 years experience working with students of all ages in an inclusive education context. Shelley has served New Brunswick students as a classroom teacher, guidance counselor, school administrator, and district-based itinerant resource teacher for autism. In her current role as learning specialist for autism and complex cases within the Brunswick Department of Education and Early Childhood Development, Shelley coordinates and supports provincial initiatives around training and service delivery related to autism spectrum disorders, provides consultation around students with complex needs, and engages in supervision of BCBA candidates as they complete their field work experience. Shelley holds bachelor degrees in arts and education and a master's of education degree in counseling psychology from the University of New Brunswick. She has also completed a graduate academic certificate in applied behavioral analysis from the University of North Texas. So welcome to our conference, Shelley.
Thank you. I want to start by giving you a little bit of my context as far as my path to get here, because inclusion is actually my frame of reference. I remember being a high school student when we had a local segregated school for students with special needs in our community. And when that school closed down, we had 2 students from that school who joined our class. I didn't have the educator's perspective at that time, but looking back, I'm sure that that came with some significant challenges for everybody involved. But I did have the student perspective. And again, there were a few road bumps and a few things that probably didn't go as smoothly as we might have liked overall. But after 2 years of having those 2 young gentlemen in our class, when we completed school at the end of grade 12, none of us could have imagined not having those 2 young gentlemen in our class. And we learned so much from each other that I couldn't have imagined doing anything differently. So inclusive education is where I come from, and I don't really have much of a frame of reference that doesn't include inclusion. Fast forward probably more years than I care to admit, and as a high school educator, I had the opportunity and the privilege to actually participate in the UMB training that Mr. Doherty spoke about. Not knowing a whole lot about it at the time, except the fact that my father always used to say you can never have too much education, and that's one thing no one can ever take away from you. I agreed to participate in that training. And when I did, it also came with the opportunity to leave my school for a year, to go to the district office and to work throughout the district supporting schools and school-based staff with students with autism in their schools. Geographically, my district was 300 kilometers from one end to the other and included at the time 31 schools. So the challenges were many, but one of the biggest challenges that I encountered was as I was supporting schools with students with autism spectrum disorders, I encountered two young gentlemen who had both just gone into grade 6 in different schools, different areas of the district. But when I met these young gentlemen, I was challenged to figure out how to help schools to serve them, because what I discovered was that the way that I thought I understood inclusion and the needs that I saw in these 2 boys, I was really having a hard time reconciling in my mind how to make that fit. So it left me with a quandary, and it's a quandary that I've spent the last few years, and that was 8 years ago. I've spent the last few years trying to figure out how to resolve that quandary, not just for myself in that role, but in the current role that I'm in, how do we resolve that quandary provincially? And one of the first things that I did was I took a step back and I looked at what was my perception of what I thought inclusive education was, and then what is the definition of inclusive education in New Brunswick. So I took a look many times now at the definition of inclusive education. The other thing that I think that we need to look at, and we hear the term thrown around probably almost too loosely, but is what is evidence-based practice? And what are evidence-based interventions, and what does that mean? And then once we have those two pieces of information, how do we put that together so that we really are addressing the needs of students with autism in our schools in New Brunswick? So if I look at the 2009 definition of inclusive education, the vision of that statement is that inclusive education is an evolving and systemic model of inclusive education where all children reach their full learning potential and decisions are based on the individual needs of the student and founded on evidence. And regardless of the session that I've been in over the past 2 days, regardless of the position that the presenter may have, that's consistent. I've heard that across presentations for the past 2 days. That's the vision of our definition of inclusive education for New Brunswick. So what that says is that it's not a static process. It's not written in stone. It's not something we never look at, the evidence, we never look at what we're doing or how we're implementing it. We consistently need to be reflecting on our practices. We consistently need to be reflecting on what the research and what the evidence tells us, and we consistently need to figure out how to do that better in support of our students in New Brunswick schools. The definition also says that all students are respected as individuals. Again, that's a consistent message that I've heard across every presentation for the past 2 days. All students have the right to learn in a positive learning environment, and that's positive in terms of overall atmosphere, but that's also positive in terms of their individual needs, their individual strengths, and those being recognized, understood, and respected by those who are supporting those students. The common learning environment, including curriculum and instruction, is structured and adapted such that all students learn to their best potential. In behavior analysis, we talk about antecedent interventions. Mr. Doherty talked about the learning environment. How can we set those areas up for success for our students? I worked with one student, for example, and it took us a long time to figure out what the challenge was, but white noise to him would be like, maybe to you and I, fingers on a chalkboard. And he sat too close to a computer that was running all day long. As soon as we made that change to his learning environment, we saw a significant change in his behavior. Now, we were not what we may term one-trial learners. It took us a while to figure out what that challenge was. But we saw significant changes when we were able to make a tiny little adjustment to the learning environment for that student. So the power of proactive and intentional planning is a piece of this definition as well. Further on in the definition, we read that curricular and other learning must take place in the most inclusive environment in which learning outcomes can be achieved, meaning that before considering a learning environment outside of the common learning environment, it must be clearly demonstrated that the learning outcomes could not be met in a more inclusive environment despite all reasonable efforts to provide support and accommodation, and monitored on an ongoing basis, and participation in the common learning environment is reestablished when it meets the needs of the student and other students. That doesn't say that an environment outside of the common learning environment is never considered. For some students, that area outside of a common learning environment for a specific purpose may be the best solution for a period of time. What we run the risk of happening, though, is that happens, the intentionality, the ongoing monitoring are not in place, and so it's out of sight and out of mind, potentially. And that's not what we want for any of our students or any of our children. We talk about temporary situations that have been created outside of the learning environment to better assist the student to meet his or her learning outcomes within the common learning environment. So when we think about all of our students, we want to talk about meaningful experiences and meaningful learning. And what is meaningful learning for each individual student has to be examined based on his or her individual needs. We have students with autism who have no language, but may be able to develop that language. So there may be the need to be able to do that in an area where there are few distractions, where there's intensive intervention that can take place, to be able to encourage those meaningful interactions to happen across multiple environments once those skills have been built. So once I looked at the definition of inclusive education, the second piece was, okay, but what does that mean with respect to evidence-based interventions and evidence-based practice? So early on in this role, it took me a while to figure out and sort out exactly what all of that meant. But we know that, and what we want for our teachers is that as educators, we're expected to identify and disseminate practices that have empirical effectiveness, empirical evidence of effectiveness. And understanding and knowledge of evidence-based interventions is integral to evidence-based practice, is founded on a belief that interventions with empirical base are more likely to be effective than those that have not been demonstrated scientifically to be effective. I had the pleasure of attending a conference back a few years ago, and one of the presenters, her opening slide was a t-shirt that said, "Don't waste my time." And I have a colleague in another province who says, if I could make those t-shirts for all of the students with autism in our schools, I would make those t-shirts. Because what we need to be looking at is what are the strategies that we know are most likely to be effective for our students with autism, and how can we implement those in the conditions that we currently have within our schools in a way that makes sense for everybody. Our students with autism in many cases have a lot of catching up to do, or have skill deficits that are quite substantial that we need to be filling those gaps as quickly as possible by making every opportunity, every day, a learning opportunity for those students. They don't have time to waste. And so across the day, learning has to be taking place at every single moment, and that takes intentional planning. So when I took all of that and looked at, okay, I understand the concept of evidence-based intervention, understand the concept of evidence-based practice, but how do I know what is evidence-based? And I could have spent ages and ages looking through the peer-reviewed research journals and trying to figure out what that was. Fortunately, over the past few years, there have been a number of very comprehensive reviews of the literature that have done that work for us. And I'll just cite a few of them for you. I can provide the references if you'd like to take a look at them. But in 2009, the National Autism Center released, they called their National Standards Project Report, which reviewed literature published in peer-reviewed journals from 1957 to 2007 and established or provided an overview of established treatments, unestablished treatments, and ineffective and emerging treatments. The National Center for Professional Development for Autism Spectrum Disorders did a similar review of all of the research, so that's available. The Maine Department of Health and Human Services and Department of Education, again, released a similar report back in 2009. So you can take those reviews of the literature and put the results side by side, and even though there were a number of differences in terms of their selection criteria, a number of differences in terms of the way they took those reviews and the way they presented their results, in spite of those differences, there's very little disagreement among the reviewers that for individuals with autism spectrum disorders, interventions based on applied behavior analysis have the strongest empirical evidence at the moment. So we know that. So knowing that and knowing the definition of inclusion, inclusive education, what do we do? How do we reconcile this issue? The problem that we run into, in my mind anyway, is that we often start at the wrong end of the question. We often start by asking, where are we going to put this student to learn what needs to be learned? And what we need to be starting with is asking, what are the skills that this particular student needs to build? So question one, what are the meaningful goals and outcomes the team, and that's the school team, family team, everybody involved in that child's life, What has been identified as being priorities for that particular student? Does the student have the prerequisite skills to be able to learn those particular outcomes? And the individual we often miss in that discussion is the student himself or the student herself. And sometimes we forget that as part of identifying those meaningful goals and outcomes, to the extent that the student is able to participate in the discussion, we need to be involving the student in that discussion. The second question that we need to be asking is, can instruction or practice of the skills be embedded within the regular routines in the common learning environment? That might be the classroom, that might be the swimming pool, that might be the playground, that might be the gym. What is the common learning environment? Can we embed instruction on those skills within that environment in a reasonable way? Or do some accommodations, do some adjustments to the environment need to be made in order to make that happen? And then if instruction on those particular skills cannot happen because it's deemed not to be in the best interest of the student for those to happen in a common learning environment, then where can instruction on those skills happen? If it's important, don't just do it willy-nilly. If it's important, schedule it, make it intentional, plan it, monitor it, and then figure out how to generalize those skills back into a common learning environment, back into a meaningful family experience, back into a meaningful peer interaction experience. So when will it happen? Where will it happen? With whom? Who's the best person to provide instruction or practice on that skill? Is it a teacher? Is it an educational assistant? Is it a peer, perhaps? One of the places to get the biggest bang for our buck, I believe, is around peer training. And we need to be incorporating all of those elements that we have at our disposal to be able to help build skills in our students with autism. For how long is it going to happen? So again, let's not lose sight of the fact that there's a different learning environment possibly in place, and we need to move those skills back. And then if we look back to the definition, I'll finish the way I started. Inclusive education is a pairing of philosophy and pedagogical practices that allow each student to feel respected, confident, and safe so he or she can learn and develop to his or her full potential. It's based on a system of values and beliefs centered on the best interest of the student, which promotes social cohesion, belonging, active participation in learning, a complete school experience, and positive interactions with peers and others in the school community. Now, having said that, I'm not naive enough to stand here and try to tell you that this is happening perfectly in all of our schools in New Brunswick. I know it's not, but there are many, many examples where it is happening really well, and where it's not happening really well, we need to support folks to be able to do it better. And so that's part of the role that we need to take on as a system. We're prepared to take that on. We have a commitment from our minister to take that on. And so that's one of the mandates that we need to be able to put in place, and we need to be able to help people to do this better because our kids don't have time to waste and they deserve the best that we can give them. Thank you.
I think there's a lot of people just coming in the door that are a little ticked off at me right now, but I felt it was important to give everybody an opportunity to share their insights and to identify those challenges. We can perhaps take one or two questions before we close. Yes, go ahead, please.
Question mostly for the folks who've dealt primarily with the education system, the last speaker and then Mr. Doherty. But I was wondering if there are any specified behavior analytic technologies which are mandated to be used. I know in Maine that we have a regulation where if a pattern of behavior such as biting one's wrist or something like that appears to be interfering with a child's progress educationally, that you must conduct a functional behavioral assessment, which is basically a very, as you know, a very thorough way of evaluating which antecedents appear to occasion behavior and which sort of consequences are maintaining behavior. Is there any sort of push toward that? That was something that happened, I think, about 10 years ago. It was before my time doing much work, but yeah.
Can we have just a reasonably short answer? I mean,
yes.
Yeah,
how's that?
Go ahead.
Okay. Yes, we do. In every district throughout the province, we have folks who are trained to do functional behavior assessment. And so if they're not available at the school level, there are certainly folks within the districts who can provide that type of support for sure.